Today, most people dream of a life of wealth, luxury and freedom, and throughout history many people have attained this or were born into it, though it's not always as good as it seems. In today's video, we will be exploring the lives of various millionaire heiresses who had quite tragic stories, and who you probably wouldn't want to be. Join me as we explore their lives. For our first story, we are going to early 20th century United States, where one heiress ended up having an especially troubled private life, despite her millions. Barbara Woolworth Hutton was born in New York City on the 14th of November 1912. Her father was Franklin Laws Hutton, a wealthy co-owner and founder of E.F. Hutton & Company, a New York-based investment banking and financial company. However, while her father was successful in his own right, Barbara's future wealth would ascend to her through her mother, Edna Woolworth. Edna Woolworth was one of 3 children of the American businessman Frank Winfield Woolworth. In the late 19th century, Frank Woolworth had made an enormous amount of money after pioneering the concept of 5 and dime shops, retail stores in which everything generally was priced at 5 or 10 cents. The forerunner of the modern-day dollar or pound shop. Woolworth's idea was enormously successful, and just months after Barbara was born, he opened the Woolworth Building in New York, the company headquarters, which cost $13.5 million to build, and which was the tallest building in the world until 1930. Despite her family's wealth, Barbara's childhood was very troubled. Her father was a serial philanderer, engaging in a string of extramarital affairs, and he was not exactly discreet in these. Moreover, he was also a neglectful father and a heavy drinker. Thus, when Barbara's mother died suddenly on the 2nd of May 1917, at just 33 years of age, many people suspected that she had taken her own life. The coroner's report officially stated that she had died from suffocation brought on by mastoiditis, a serious infection of the ear, nose and throat system, but the fact that an autopsy was never performed led many to doubt the veracity of this. Her mother's passing was especially cruel for Barbara, as it was she who had found her mother's lifeless body. She had only been 5 years old, but the memory surely stayed with her. Thereafter, her father effectively sent her off to be raised by a governess and to attend a series of private schools in New York and in Farmington, Connecticut. In the years that followed, events occurred which would shape the rest of her life. In 1919, her maternal grandfather, the founder of Woolworths, died, and then in 1924, her maternal grandmother also passed. As the only child of Edna Woolworth, Barbara now inherited the 1/3 of the Woolworth estate, which would have descended to her mother. This amounted to nearly $30 million at the time, a sum equal to over $500 million in today's money. Barbara did not have access to this money immediately, given her youth, and her father invested it well enough on her behalf that when she finally acquired direct control over it in the early 1930s, the value of it exceeded $50 million, a sum in excess of $1 billion today. By the time she acquired this vast estate, Barbara had already acquired a reputation within American high society, and not a good one. In late 1929, the Wall Street Stock Exchange had taken enormous losses after the economic boom of the 1920s. In the months that followed, the American and world economy drifted into the Great Depression, as many lost their savings, and millions of Americans ended up out of work. It was thus viewed as socially toxic when Barbara's family held an ostentatious debutante ball for her in New York, on the occasion of her 18th birthday in November 1930, one which included guest singing by Rudy Vallee, one of the leading entertainers of the day, and cost over $60,000, a sum equivalent to over $1 million in modern terms. This was incredibly inappropriate given that financiers such as the Huttons were largely seen as having caused much of the country's economic woes, and Barbara was savagely attacked in the press as a result. They referred to her as the poor little rich girl, a reference to her great fortune and also her troubled family background. It was a moniker which would characterize much of her adult life as well. Barbara Hutton's life is perhaps most memorable for her many marriages, 7 in all. The first of these was entered into when she was just 20 years of age and was to Alexiv Midavani. He was the scion of a Georgian family which had fled from the Caucasus in the early 1920s, claiming they were being persecuted by the Soviet authorities there. The family were social climbers, and when he met Barbara, Alexis was already married to Louise Van Allen, a member of the wealthy Astor family. He quickly divorced her to marry Barbara, who was wealthier, on the 22nd of June 1933. As one might have expected from such a figure, he immediately began spending vast amounts of Barbara's money, on top of the $1 million dowry that had been provided to the Midavani family as part of the union. By the time Barbara realized exactly what was afoot and divorced him in the summer of 1935, she had lost a considerable amount of money. Barbara's second marriage was even less successful. This was to Kurt Huguette Reventlow, a minor Danish noble. They were married just weeks after her split from Alexis, but the marriage soon deteriorated. He was both physically and emotionally abusive, a situation which led Barbara to begin drinking heavily and taking drugs, habits which she would never kick. She also developed anorexia during their 3-year marriage. Her relationship with Kurt was complicated by their having a child, a boy called Lance, who was born in 1937 and who would be Barbara's only child. It has been speculated that Barbara's anorexia was calculated to ensure that she could not have another child, and indeed, it did result in her inability to become pregnant. However, there is no doubting that she bore some affection towards her son Lance. She successfully contested with Kurt to have custody of him when they divorced in 1938, and while she did send him to be raised by a governess and at private boarding schools, this was simply reflective of her own upbringing and hardly unusual for American high society of the 1930s. While her marriage to Kurt had been a dreadful experience, Barbara entered into a slightly happier time in her life in the years that followed. When the Second World War broke out in September 1939, she became an active fundraiser for the cause in America, a country which was sympathetic towards the plight of Britain, France, and the other victims of Nazi aggression in Europe, but which was unwilling to enter the war in its earlier years. Hutton provided funding and actively campaigned for further aid to the Free French after France was conquered in the summer of 1940. By this time she had moved to California and was using her profile to actively sell war bonds once the US entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in December 1941. It was while she was here that her relationship with the actor Cary Grant intensified. Barbara had met the star of Bringing Up Baby, His Girl Friday, and The Philadelphia Story some years earlier through their mutual acquaintance, the millionaire and philanthropist Howard Hughes. They married in July 1942, and they were mockingly nicknamed Cash and Carey by the media. The union was one of her happier ones, though it too did not last long, and they divorced in 1945. However, Grant never tried to acquire any of Barbara's money, and they both claimed that they remained close friends long after their divorce. After her marriage to Grant ended, and with the Second World War over, Hutton moved to Europe for several years. There she married Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a French aristocrat and athlete of Russian descent, in 1947. He used Barbara's money to aid in his efforts to become one of Europe's leading race car drivers, as professional car racing was entering its first golden age in the late 1940s. The union, as with all of Barbara's, ended just after a few years when they divorced in 1951. She did not respond well to this, and the collapse of her fourth marriage, combined with her spiraling drug and alcohol abuse and anorexia, led Barbara to attempt to take her own life. What was worse, news of this leaked out to the media in the early 1950s, and Barbara Hutton was once again reported on in the US and European media as the poor little rich girl, over 20 years after first acquiring that moniker. In December 1953, Barbara stumbled into her fifth and briefest marriage. This was with Porfirio Rubirosa, a diplomat and playboy from the Dominican Republic. It was perhaps Barbara's most unusual relationship. Porfirio had previously been married to Doris Duke, an American heiress of the Duke tobacco family fortune. Doris and Barbara had been born within days of each other in 1912, were two of the wealthiest women in the world, and had developed a curious rivalry over the years. She had married Rubirosa in 1947, but the marriage ended after a brief time, with Rubirosa acquiring an enormous financial settlement in the divorce proceedings. Now, Barbara seemed to be adding salt to the wound by marrying her rival's ex-husband. The view that it was a sham marriage would certainly be suggested by how long it lasted, or didn't last, as the case may be. Hutton and Rubirosa divorced after just 53 days. He once again walked away with a large settlement. Bizarrely, Rubirosa acquired a converted B-25 bomber plane in his divorce settlement from both Duke and Hutton. Barbara would marry two further times. Her sixth marriage was to Baron Gottfried Alexander von Kram, a professional German tennis player whom she had known for some years and who had won the French Open twice in the 1930s. They wed in 1955 and divorced in 1959. After that, Barbara married just once more, to Prince Raymond Duan Wienhana Champasak, a Lao aristocrat. Their marriage lasted just over a year in the mid-1960s. Barbara's seventh marriage was her last. By the time it ended in the mid-1960s, her life was taking on a tragic appearance. Her alcohol and drug problems combined with her anorexia had resulted in many health problems by the time she reached her 50s, while her lavish spending and divorce settlements had resulted in a huge proportion of her vast wealth being spent, stolen or squandered over the years. Much of this was also owing to her own great generosity. Friends and acquaintances always knew she would listen to their requests for financial support for one endeavour or another, but this left a woman who was frequently intoxicated, also open to exploitation. This tragic later life was compounded in 1972, when her only child Lance, from her second marriage, was killed in an air accident in his mid-30s. After this, Barbara became increasingly reclusive. She sold some of her homes to try and stabilise her finances, and moved into the penthouse of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles in the mid-1970s. It was here that she lived out the last period of her life, addicted to painkillers and alcohol, and nearly blind. She died of a heart attack there on the 11th of May 1979, at 66 years of age. At the time, it was widely believed that she had just $3,500 left in her name, having been one of the world's richest women a half a century earlier, though it is unclear what wealth she actually possessed, if her assets were included. In any event, it was a tragic end to the life of America's prominent poor little rich girl. Next, we are looking into the tobacco heiress, who was dubbed the richest girl in the world. Throughout her life, she was subject to significant unwanted press attention, and even got away with murder. Doris Duke was born on the 22nd of November 1912 in New York City. She was the only child of James Buchanan Duke and his second wife, Nanaline Holt Inman. James's first marriage to Lillian Fletcher Macready had quickly ended in divorce in 1906 and had not produced any children. As such, Doris was the only child of Duke, and his wealth would shape her entire life. James Buchanan Duke was the owner and founder of the American Tobacco Company, which he had established in 1890. The American Tobacco Company was known for having introduced several innovations into the manufacture of cigarettes, notably the paper used to roll them, and also the first efforts to chemically manipulate the ingredients used. Duke's company was soon raking in enormous profits at the height of the Gilded Age, and he consolidated his control of the market. By the end of the 19th century, the American Tobacco Company was selling approximately 90% of all the cigarettes smoked in the United States, and this was at a time when it was more usual for an adult to smoke than to not do so. As a result of all of this, The Dukes were amongst the wealthiest families in America. James engaged in significant philanthropy, including massive funding to Trinity College in North Carolina, which would subsequently be renamed Duke University in recognition of his immense funding. Doris grew up on her family's enormous estate in Hillsborough Township in New Jersey. Duke Farms, as it was known, was a 2,700-acre estate. When her father died in 1925, she effectively inherited the main bulk of his enormous estate, which was valued at the time of upwards of $100 million, a sum equivalent to in excess of $1 billion today. However, she did not receive the money at this point in time owing to her youth. Rather, an arrangement had been put in place whereby Doris would acquire control of the estate in tranches as she moved through her 20s. Duke came of age just as the United States was plunged into the Great Depression following the Wall Street crash of the autumn of 1929. In this context, the holding of lavish debutante parties for figures such as Doris and her contemporary, Barbara Hutton, the heiress to the Woolworth family fortune, in the early 1930s, generated interest and criticism in equal measure amongst the American press at the time. She and Hutton were nicknamed the Gold Dust Twins, and individually as the richest girl in the world, or Poor Little Rich Girl. In 1935, when she was just 22 years of age, Duke stunned those who knew her and the celebrity press when she decided to marry an inspiring politician by the name of Jimmy Cromwell. Cromwell was 16 years older than her and began to use Doris's wealth to advance his political ambitions. He too came from a moneyed background, though one considerably less affluent than Duke's. After an initial 2-year around-the-world honeymoon, the Cromwells settled briefly in Hawaii, where they built a mansion which they named Shangri-La. However, their marriage began to unravel in the early 1940s. First, he was appointed as a US ambassador to Canada, but Doris did not take to the country and left for Hawaii. Then their first child was born prematurely that summer and died the following day in Honolulu. After this, Doris and Jimmy gradually drifted apart, and in 1943, they divorced. The death of her first child and the breakdown of her marriage led Doris to become an increasingly tragic figure. This was compounded by receipt of the news that her pregnancy and the complications with it in 1940 made it almost certain that she would be unable to have any further children. In response to this, Doris began engaging in eccentric behaviour, consulting with fortune tellers and others whom she believed would allow her to commune with her dead daughter. However, more worrying was her growing reliance on alcohol and various prescription drugs, including opiates. In 1947, Duke married for the second and last time. This was to Porfirio Rubirosa, a diplomat and playboy from the Dominican Republic. The union provoked considerable controversy, not least owing to the intervention of the US State Department, which cautioned Duke about allowing Rubirosa to use her immense wealth for his own political purposes. Despite this warning, she still provided him with immense amounts of money. Both were seemingly unfaithful, and the marriage ended in 1951, with Rubirosa acquiring a huge financial settlement as part of the divorce, one which bizarrely involved a converted B-25 bomber plane. Duke would not marry again, but she did continue to find her way into the public limelight through rumours concerning her many affairs with individuals such as the famed actor Errol Flynn, and later the jazz pianist Joe Castro. Perhaps the most unusual of these rumours surrounding her love life was one which held that Doris had previously had an affair with General George Patton, one of the great commanders of the Second World War. However, Patton was nearly 30 years older than Duke, and this seems unlikely. While there is some disagreement about Duke's relationships, her philanthropic work is a matter of concrete public record. She used a substantial amount of her wealth to invest in the arts and horticulture between the 1940s and the 1980s. She had an especial interest in the Islamic and Southeast Asian art, and built up an extensive collection of pieces dating to the medieval and early modern periods. In terms of her horticultural interests, much of these were focused on developing Duke farms where she had grown up. Here, Duke began developing Duke Gardens in the late 1950s, an extensive series of greenhouses, botanical gardens and conservatories with artificial lakes and patios. Duke took an immense personal pride in this project and often spent long days working herself at Duke Gardens in the late 1950s and into the 1960s. She also cultivated friendships with some of the leading figures in the field, notably Louis Bromfield, who had won the Pulitzer Prize in 1927 for his book Early Autumn. With funding from Duke, Bromfield went on to establish the Malabar Farm in Mansfield, Ohio, an experimental horticulture site in the state located on nearly 1,000 acres of land. She also wrote during these years for a time for Harper's Bazaar, and in 1945 briefly as a journalist in Europe at the end of the Second World War with the International News Service. However, as Duke got older, she became more eccentric, and as her mind started to deteriorate, her writing efforts trailed off. The years had passed, and Duke was now a woman with a very troubling alcohol and drug problem, one which led to the most controversial episode in her life in 1966. By the 1960s, Duke had acquired several homes and mansions across America, in New Jersey, New York, Los Angeles, Rhode Island, and Hawaii. As a result, she had many staff in her employ that were tasked with managing and maintaining these large estates. One such employee was Eduardo Tirella, a curator of Duke's significant art holdings. Tirella had been employed by Duke for years, but in 1966, he was set on pursuing a career in production design in Hollywood. When Tirella went to Duke to tell her about his decision on the evening of the 6th of October 1966, the two ended up in a heated argument. This was at her house at Rough Point in Newport, Rhode Island. They then got into a rented car to drive it up to the house. When they reached the gates of Duke's mansion here, Tirella exited the car and went to open the gates. What followed next is a matter of serious dispute. What we know is that he'd been driving the car and had left the engine running when he got out to attend to the gates. As he did so, Duke got out of the passenger seat and sat into the driver's seat. She later testified that she was intending to simply move the car forward to collect Tirella when he had opened the gates, but that she accidentally hit the accelerator. The evidence at the site was not consistent afterwards with this explanation, and the outcome was brutal. In the moments that followed, the car crashed into Tirella, smashing him between the car and the gate. He died shortly afterwards from his injuries. In the aftermath of the incident, the Tirella family sued Duke for wrongful death. A settlement of approximately $75,000 was made, one which would equate to about $500,000 today. The investigation remained pending for several years thereafter, but Duke, who was quite probably intoxicated on the evening in question, was eventually able to avoid any further punishment or criminal charges by bribes and providing large amounts of public funding to Newport Town Council and other local charities. Despite avoiding jail time following the Tirella incident in 1966, Duke's reputation within US high society circles never fully recovered. As a result, in the 1970s and 1980s, she became more reclusive, and her alcohol and drug use, which was already considerable, began to increase further. Towards the end of her 70s, Duke was convinced by her medical advisors to undergo a series of operations. Some of these were necessary medical measures, such as a knee replacement, but others, including a facelift, were purely cosmetic. The knee replacement surgery, though a fairly routine operation today, was still a difficult one in the early 1990s. It was botched in Duke's case, leaving her confined to a wheelchair for the remainder of her life. It was during this post-operation period that Duke, who was increasingly frail and disoriented, signed a new will, making her butler, Bernard Lafferty, the primary beneficiary of her estate. Lafferty was a nefarious character who had been employed years earlier by Duke, more as a drinking companion than for any other reason. This change to Duke's will took on a sinister note just months later when Duke experienced a bout of choking on her food and Lafferty refused to call an ambulance. Then just weeks later, after a few trips in and out of the hospital and while medicated on huge amounts of morphine and other painkillers, she passed away on the 28th of October 1993. Duke was 80 years of age. Her ashes were subsequently scattered in the Pacific Ocean. Contention arose immediately over her estate, valued at $1.3 billion, with lawyers representing various parties accusing Lafferty of having manipulated Duke into altering her will in her last months, even while she was increasingly unsure of her own actions. Eventually, the California courts intervened and decided that the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation would receive a very large proportion of the estate. Yet, Lafferty still received a $4.5 million one-off amount and $500,000 annually thereafter. Following this, he left for Los Angeles, where he died in 1996. Shortly before his death, he was exonerated in an investigation launched by the District Attorney of Los Angeles to determine if Duke was murdered or died from complications owing to her medical conditions. In 2020, a new report was produced on the circumstances surrounding the death of Eduardo Tirela in 1966 by Peter Lance, an investigative journalist at Newport Daily News. He concluded from a fresh assessment of all the evidence that Duke had not only purposefully run into Tirela with the car while he was opening the gate, but that she had then run him over a second time after he was on the ground. The official reports had then been doctored, or parts of them were removed from what was made available to the Tirela family. A life of solitude outside the public sphere may sound ideal to some, but the Copper heiress's distrust of others, health problems, and the way she lived is something few people would wish for. Huguette Marcel Clark was born on the 9th of June 1906 in the city of Paris in France. Huguette was the second eldest daughter of William A. Clark, while her mother was Anna Eugenia Clark, William's second wife. Her father, who was nearing his 70th year at the time of Huguette's birth, was a leading figure of American life in the early 20th century. He had earned a fortune during the westward expansion of the United States into Montana and other regions from the 1860s onwards, and had then used the money earned to diversify into railway construction during the railroad boom. From there he had moved into politics, becoming a senator for Montana in the 1890s. Accordingly, Huguette was born into one of the richest and most powerful families in late Gilded Age America. Huguette spent her early life living in Paris, as the Clarks associated with some of Europe's high society. For instance, in 1911, she was present with her family at the coronation of King George V of Britain. She was, though, soon sent back to America to be educated at the Spence School, an all-girls private school in Manhattan, New York, in the early 1910s. Here, she resided along with several other members of her family at the Fifth Avenue house, an enormous 6-story, 121-room building, which was believed to be the largest single-ownership house in New York City at the time. When she was born in 1906, Huguette had many siblings and half-siblings. Her father had 7 children from his first marriage, and though 2 of these had died in infancy, 5 lived beyond childhood, although another, Paul Clark, died in his late teens in 1896. Thus, Huguette had 4 half-siblings, Mary, Charles, Catherine and William, each of whom were approximately 30 to 40 years older than her. In addition, Huguette had 1 full-blood sibling, a sister Andrée, who was born 4 years before her, but who died young as well from meningitis in 1919. The familial arrangement was significant, for the patriarch of the family was aging, and his fortune would soon be inherited by his children. This fortune was very considerable, for Clark had continued to develop his business interests, expanding in the 1900s and 1910s into additional mining operations and in the development of Las Vegas in its early days as a stop-off point for travelers on the way out to Los Angeles. Thus, when he eventually did die on the 2nd of March 1925 in New York City, his wealth was estimated to be approximately $300 million. Adjusted for inflation, this would be the equivalent of over $5 billion today. Thus, Clark's children stood to inherit vast riches when he passed away. Huguette certainly did not follow her father into either business or politics once she had acquired her share of his estate following his death in the spring of 1925. This is believed to have been in the region of $50 million, as her father split his fortune roughly equally between his wife and 5 living children. Huguette was content to engage in philanthropy and develop her interests in the world of the arts and fashion. For instance, in the late 1920s, she spent some $50,000 on having a saltwater pond drained at her villa Belos Guardo in Santa Barbara in California for use as a bird refuge, one which she named the Andre Clark Bird Refuge in honor of her sister, who had died a decade earlier. Clark had ended up living briefly out in Santa Barbara after marrying one William MacDonald Glover, a law student whom she had met in New York while they were both studying. They were wed in August 1928, but the union did not last long, and they divorced a week short of their first wedding anniversary. Thus, she soon headed back to New York and installed herself in an apartment on Fifth Avenue. Here, her aesthetic senses were soon being put on display. Huguette converted the apartment and adjoining ones to create a huge open space, which looked out over Central Park in a vast chamber replete with a library and other amenities. Throughout the 1930s, Huguette engaged somewhat with East Coast society, displaying some of her paintings in a show at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and attending fashion shows in New York. However, her circle of close friends was small, and to those others who knew her during these years, she appeared elusive and taciturn. As the years passed, Huguette became more and more reclusive. She continued to spend money, but often on initiatives which she never visited or to which she donated anonymously. For instance, a mansion was built by the bird refuge out in Santa Barbara during the 1930s, and Huguette continued to pay tens of thousands of dollars every month to maintain everything there, but she very rarely visited. This reclusiveness intensified following the death of Huguette's mother in 1963, with whom she had lived in New York for most of her adult life. Thus, for much of the 1960s and 1970s, she gradually became an ever more distant figure within New York. Much of this was owing to an increasing distrust of strangers. Huguette had never remarried and had no children, so she began to view everyone in her later years as someone who was potentially trying to inveigle their way into her good graces to benefit from her will. She may not have been entirely incorrect in such a concern, but her methods were paranoid in the extreme. For instance, she increasingly preferred to speak in French to hide what she was saying from those around her. By the late 1980s, Huguette had become an almost mythical figure in New York, almost never seen or heard from, and then in such a limited way that many people believed that she was actually dead, a not inconceivable situation given that she was 80 years old in 1986. Nevertheless, Huguette was alive, though hardly well. By the late 1980s, she had become very frail and was suffering from numerous ailments, the worst being the presence of cancerous lesions on her face which had left her disfigured. Huguette had refused to seek treatment for her conditions, an eventuality which would have forced her to leave her apartment for a prolonged period to visit a hospital, but by 1991 the situation was such that there were no other options. Thus that spring, she was admitted to the Doctors' Hospital of the Upper East Side in Manhattan. There, her physicians gave a sobering account of her condition. Huguette's face had to be operated on and reconstructed. Such was the damage done to it by her refusal to have the lesions treated. Indeed, she had not been to a doctor in 2 decades, and it looked as though she rarely if ever ate. Also, her mental condition was very poor, often seeming as though she was unaware of her surroundings and those that were conversing with her. Following her surgery and recovery, Clark's doctors advised that she could head home to her apartment, but Huguette had taken to her surroundings. Accordingly, she began paying the doctor's hospital nearly $1,000 per day for her to be allowed to stay in her hospital room. After, she was moved to Beth Israel Medical Center, and she took up an 11th room floor there, overlooking Central Park, and began paying private nursing staff to care for her. As a result, Huguette Clark would spend the last 20 years of her life living in hospital, but with effectively her own semi-private wing overlooking the park. Her apartment had towered over for half a century. And curiously enough, the change of surroundings seems to have done her well. Over the years, her health and mental state improved considerably, as noted by her physicians in intermittent reports, though she remained highly eccentric nonetheless. What was curious about all of this is that Huguette did not bother to check in with any of her large number of staff members from her apartment on Fifth Avenue, the estate out in Santa Barbara in California, or a mansion she had bought back in the 1950s in Connecticut, but never actually lived in. In these various residences, staff members continued to receive their pay and continued about their work in maintaining the properties, but they had no idea where their employer was, or what had happened to her. Meanwhile, Huguette was hard at work spending most of her vast fortune before she died. Lavish sums were given in gift to individuals. A close lifelong friend of hers received $10 million. This may have been above board, but the fact that one of Huguette's private nurses at Beth Israel Medical Center, Hadassah Perry, received over $30 million in cash bequeaths and gifts seems like some element of exploitation was occurring. Then again, Huguette was a difficult woman not to get gifts from in her later years. On one occasion, she gave the repairman who fixed her television in her hospital room $25,000. Huguette finally died on the 24th of May 2011 at the age of 104. There was an immediate controversy surrounding her wealth and estate. For instance, it was revealed that Huguette had owned several very valuable paintings by numerous famed 19th and early 20th century French Impressionist painters, such as Edgar Degas and Claude Monet. Some of these had disappeared from her mansions in the years that she was residing in hospital. However, the greatest controversy surrounding Huguette's will was the dispersal of the $300 million fortune which she possessed at the time of her death. Originally, a will was presented in court which demonstrated that Huguette had wished to give away approximately 3/4 of her fortune to various charities. Some $30 million was then reserved for her private nurse, Hadassah Perry, on top of the $30 million or so of gifts and money which Huguette had granted her when she was still alive. Other stipulations allowed for a bequest to her goddaughter, Wanda Steicher, and cash payments to some of her longtime servants in her apartment on Fifth Avenue. But it was soon revealed that prior to the finalization of this will, Huguette had actually signed off on another will altogether just weeks earlier. This had been enormously different to the second will, which was finally certified. The first will had allowed for Huguette to bequeath most of her fortune to her extended family. By 2011, most of these were grandnephews and grandnieces, or even more distant relatives, some of whom Huguette had never met, and many of the older members of which she had not seen since the 1950s. Nevertheless, Huguette had at least temporarily toyed with the idea of granting away the vast majority of her estate to them. When it was revealed that there had been a first will which was quickly changed to disinherit her extended family, Huguette's relatives appealed to the courts. Their arguments were obvious. Huguette had been an extremely old woman of a questionable psychological state, and they believed her private nurse and others had coerced her in her final weeks into changing her will to make themselves the benefactors and to disinherit them. It is plausible that this was true. though it is equally plausible that Huguette simply decided to reward those people to whom she had been closest in her last 20 years. Whatever the truth of it, the judge decided that the family's argument was solid. Thus, Huguette's first will was effectively implemented, with the family receiving upwards of 75% of the entire estate. Huguette's private nurse, Hadassah Perry, was forced to return the $30 million that she had received as part of the will settlement, though on the provision that her receipt of a similar sum in gifts and other bequests over the years while Huguette was still alive would not be challenged. Thus, the Clark family ended up being the major benefactors of her will, though we will never know for sure exactly who the mysterious Huguette Clark had actually intended her wealth to descend to. She herself was entombed in the family mausoleum in the Bronx, New York City, while several of the artworks she collected during her lifetime are found in major museums and galleries today. Imagine this. Your father dies when you are just 7 years old. You have a mother who doesn't care for you, and when you are 20, she takes steps to have you sterilized, in the hopes of getting your inheritance. Well, sadly, this was the life of the unfit heiress. Ann Cooper Hewitt was born in the city of Paris on the 28th of July 1914, a date which is often considered to be the start of the First World War. It was on this day that the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia, triggering a series of declarations of war across Europe. It was an ominous beginning, which Anne's mother would remind her daughter of frequently later in her life. Her mother was Marion Jean Andrews, a woman who had previously been married to Dr. Père Sather Bruguière and Alexandra Turner Stewart Denning. Both of these men were quite wealthy, and were closely related to prominent New York bankers and financiers. However, Anne's father was neither of these men, but was one Peter Cooper Hewitt. He too was from a very prominent family, as his grandfather, Peter Hewitt, was a millionaire inventor and businessman who was a patriarch of New York City. At the time of Anne's birth, Peter was married to Lucy Bond Work, the daughter of yet another prominent and wealthy banking family. Thus, she was conceived as part of an extramarital affair which Peter was having with Marion from the early 1910s onwards. He would, though, soon divorce his wife and marry Marion. He then formally adopted Anne, perhaps to disguise the fact that she had been born as a result of an affair. With her parents' marriage in 1918, Anne became the sole child of a very wealthy family. This was primarily based on Peter's business interests. An engineer by training, in 1901 when he was 40 years old, Peter had invented the mercury vapor lamp. This was a type of gas discharging lamp that uses an electric arc transmitted through vaporized mercury to produce a very bright light. The new lamp offered enormous benefits on previously available bulbs, notably the fact that the bulbs used in it could last for up to 24,000 hours, transmitting a very bright light. This made them ideal for the use in street lamps and other environments in which very bright lights were needed, such as hospital operating theatres, stadiums, and other public buildings. Consequently, the mercury vapor lamp was quickly adopted widely across the Western world, and indeed these types of lamps are still widely used in many countries over 120 years later. And because he had invented it, and had a patent on the design, Peter Cooper Hewitt became a very wealthy man. This was the context in which Anne grew up, and it would also have a crucial bearing on the entire trajectory of her life. Anne did not know her father to any real extent. He died in the early autumn of 1921, shortly after her 7th birthday. Peter was born back in 1861, and there was a 20-year age difference between himself and Anne's mother. So, it was unsurprising for him to have died long before Marion. His will was somewhat unusual. He did not leave his entire estate to his wife, nor did he divide it equally between her and their only child. Instead, Peter willed it that Marion would receive just 1/3 of his estate, with Anne receiving the other 2/3. She would assume this wealth in the summer of 1935 when she turned 21 years of age. The sum of money was very considerable. Although his original design for the mercury vapor lamp had some design issues, by 1903 he had worked out the kinks, and the lamp was then adopted across the United States and in many European countries. This includes an innovation known as a mercury arc rectifier, which could convert alternating current power into direct current, the two types of current which had sparked the current war of the 1880s between Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse. Another boom to his finances was in the emergence of the Hollywood film industry and the adoption of Hewitte's lamps for lighting studios. As a result of these endeavours, when he died in 1921, he left behind an estate worth $4 million, a sum equivalent to upwards of $100 million in today's money, depending on how the inflation is calculated. Approximately $2.7 million of this money was put aside in trust for Anne, and she would inherit it in 1935. Sadly, the money would be central to her tragic story in the 1930s. Anne's relationship with her mother was always strained, and this continued as she grew up. Marion was cruel to her daughter, verbally insulting her by calling her an ugly duckling and an imbecile, and she would even physically hurt Anne. Many years later, Anne stated that her mother rarely came near her, instead employing a team of maids to do everything from dressing her in the morning and making her meals, to putting her to bed at night. Instead, Marion lived an aloof life, and she married twice more within a few years of Peter's death. First to Baron Frederick Émile Regis d'Erlanger in 1922, and then to George William Charles MacArthur in 1926. Marion also developed a series of nefarious habits that led to her gradually squandering the immense fortune which her husband had left her. These were a growing alcoholism and an inclination for gambling, a toxic mix for a woman with a lot of money to lose. By the 1930s, these vices were primarily being indulged out in California, where she and Anne were living in San Francisco. Meanwhile, Anne lived a secluded life, with her mother locking her away in her bedroom and deliberately trying to limit her from making friends or socializing. As Anne grew up and neared her 21st birthday, and the age when she would inherit the money her father had willed to her, her mother evidently began to scheme as to how she might acquire the wealth. And there seemed to be one way to acquire this inheritance. A stipulation of her late husband's will had been that if Marion were for some reason to outlive her daughter, and if Anne died childless, then Anne's portion of the estate would revert to Marion. This was a common sense approach, but Marion tried to exploit this in a particularly sinister fashion as her daughter neared her 21st birthday. In August 1934, when she was 20 years old, Anne was having lunch with her mother on the outskirts of San Diego when she developed an uncomfortable ache in her abdomen. Anne was immediately rushed off to a hospital, and at the door she came into contact with a Dr. Tilton Tillman. As soon as the doctor saw Anne, he informed her that she was suffering from appendicitis and would have to undergo surgery to have the appendix removed. Appendicitis was hardly an unusual diagnosis, but some time later Anne revealed that at no stage did Dr. Tillman physically examine her to confirm that this was actually what she was suffering from. Anne underwent surgery 4 days later and spent several weeks recuperating in hospital. During this time, she became increasingly suspicious about what was occurring. She overheard several conversations where doctors and nurses spoke secretly about her care, referring to her as an idiot patient. What Anne would soon come to discover was that as well as having her appendix removed during the surgery, doctors had also carried out a salpingectomy, a treatment which involved the removal of her fallopian tubes. This surgery is normally carried out to prevent cancer or to treat an ectopic pregnancy. But in this particular instance, Anne's mother had schemed to have her doctors carry out the procedure as a form of sterilization so that she could not have children. She had managed to convince them to do this by bribing them and telling other staff of the hospital that Anne was a simpleton. During this time, eugenics was still an acceptable part of Western scientific and medical thought, so the doctors carried out the procedure in order to prevent Anne from having children who might also be mentally incapacitated. Anne would now never have children, and so one of the core provisions of her father's will was in place for Marion to acquire Anne's money. Anne did not roll over and accept this appalling travesty of medical injustice and physical butchery. Instead, she hired legal counsel, and in January 1936, at a very public press conference in an office in San Francisco, she declared to gathered reporters that she was suing her mother for $500,000, claiming that Marion had hired 2 doctors to sterilize her, and that she had also paid them off using money taken from Anne's trust. The press ate up the story, which pitted a malevolent mother against a rich young heiress. Through 1936, there were dozens of stories printed in some of the country's leading newspapers. Eventually, things turned nasty. The police got involved, and both Marion and the 2 doctors she had bribed were arrested and charged with mayhem, a loosely defined crime which could involve maiming or disfiguring a person. If found guilty, Anne's mother was looking at serving up to 14 years in prison. But it never got that far. Ultimately, when the police caught up with Marion, they found her in a hospital in New Jersey after attempting to commit suicide. When it came down to it, Anne wasn't prepared to testify against her in court if it meant sending her to prison, and so the case was quietly dropped. Marion's scheme would never come to fruition. While Anne could never have children, she still had to die before marrying in order for her mother to acquire the $2.7 million part of the estate, and this never occurred. In fact, Marion was dead within a few years. She died on the 30th of April 1939, aged 57, while living in a 1-bedroom hovel of an apartment in New York City, broke and alone. Anne went on to have a colourful life thereafter. Although tragically she could never have children, she married a total of 6 times. Unlike her mother, she didn't seek out wealthy husbands. She had no need to. Instead, she married a line of men from modest backgrounds, including a miner, a barman, and a cowboy, who doubled as a disc jockey. The disc jockey and sometime cowboy was none other than Frank Rodeo Roy Nicholson, and he was both husband number 4 and husband number 6, Anne having divorced him once and then reconciled and remarried him again sometime later. Her marriage to Nicholson created news headlines again for Anne in the late 1940s, when she married him for the first time. Nicholson divorced his existing wife in order to marry Anne, but his wife was then found dead just hours after the divorce was finalized. Her death was later determined to be a suicide, and Nicholson was exonerated from any involvement, but the newspapers wrote up the story to make it seem as salacious as possible, while just weeks later, Anne and Frank were involved in further legal difficulties when they were found to have perjured themselves in evidence presented as part of California's premarital blood test law in order to speed up their marriage. The final act in Anne's dramatic life story came in the 1950s, in the context of the Communist Red Scare in America. This was because she decided to run for the US Senate in the state of Nevada in order to fight communism. Frank became her campaign manager as she ran on the Republican ticket, but in a bizarre turn of events, he also publicly stated that he intended to vote for her Democratic opponent. The campaign never went anywhere, beyond generating some sensationalist headlines. Anne died not long after from cancer in February 1956, while in Mexico, aged just 41, though some sources say she was 40. Her wealth, which her mother had schemed so viciously to acquire, was left to Frank Rodeo Roy Nicholson. For our final tale, we are going to late 19th century America, where one teen was married off to a British duke against her will, so her mother could improve her social standing. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born in New York City on the 2nd of March 1877. Her father was William Kissam Vanderbilt, a scion of one of America's wealthiest families of the Gilded Age. Vanderbilt was a railway executive, one who famously renamed the P.T. Barnum Great Roman Hippodrome in New York as Madison Square Garden in 1879, 2 years after Consuelo was born. Her mother was Alva Erskine Smith, a future leader of the American suffragist movement. Consuelo was named after her godmother, her mother's closest friend, Consuelo Iznaga, who was half Cuban. Despite being born into an extremely affluent family, Consuelo's upbringing was less than ideal, especially by modern standards. Growing up, she was required to wear a steel rod along her back to ensure that she had the straightest possible posture. Her mother imposed this and was a generally domineering figure, one who dictated what Consuelo wore and was not shy of using physical punishment if Consuelo disobeyed her. Also, her childhood was pretty isolated, as she was homeschooled by a series of private tutors and teachers. One must understand the wider family dynamic in order to comprehend how Consuelo's life played out in the ensuing decades. She was born into the Vanderbilt family, one of the richest and most powerful families in Gilded Age America, who owed their wealth to Consuelo's great-grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Cornelius had built his first fortune in the 1830s and 1840s by becoming the most significant figure in the shipping and transport industry in New York City and along the Hudson River. He used the money he made from these ventures to diversify into the railroad industry, laying down tens of thousands of kilometers of railway lines across the United States in the 1850s and 1860s. By the 1870s, shortly before his death, he was believed to have become the richest man in the world, though these things were harder to quantify in the 19th century than they are today. Consuelo's grandfather, Cornelius' son, William Henry Vanderbilt, inherited most of the Vanderbilt fortune when his father died in 1877, but William died just a few years later in 1885, and thereafter, the Vanderbilt fortune was divided out amongst an ever-growing number of family members. Yet the primary beneficiaries of William's will were Cornelius Vanderbilt II, Consuelo's uncle, and her father, who inherited somewhere in the region of $55 million, a sum equivalent to nearly $2 billion in today's money. Thus, Consuelo was born into a family of immense wealth. Unfortunately, that wealth would serve as much to shape her life negatively as it did positively. From the beginning of her teenage years, there was already speculation as to who Consuelo might marry. She was, after all, a daughter of one of the richest men in the world, and a marriage to her would bring enormous riches to any potential husband. Her mother was intensely aware of this and was determined that Consuelo would enter into a high-status marriage. Moreover, as she became a young woman, it was evident that the Vanderbilt heiress was not just immensely rich, but also very attractive. J.M. Barrie, the author of Peter Pan, once joked of her, "I would stand all day in the street to see Consuelo get into her carriage." By the time she entered her late teens, Consuelo's mother seems to have determined that her daughter would marry into the British aristocracy. She was not alone in this, as many American families became immensely wealthy in the second half of the 19th century. They used their daughters as what became known as dollar princesses, whereby a rich American heiress married a British aristocrat. New money in America joined with old world nobility in these unions. Yet, there was another reason for Alva's insistence. In March 1895, Alva had divorced her husband William Vanderbilt, and as a result, had been exiled from high society. Desperate to regain her social standing, Alva needed Consuelo to marry a noble of very high standing, and luckily for her, there was an ideal candidate for such a union. This was Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. Marlborough was a descendant of one of the most acclaimed noble families of Britain, the first Duke having led the British war effort during the War of Spanish Succession in the early 18th century. Back then he had built one of Britain's grandest estates, known as Blenheim Palace. However, the Spencer Churchills had fallen into some economic distress by the late 19th century, despite the great honour of their household. Thus, the match between the 9th Duke and Consuelo was a marriage of convenience. Marlborough would obtain the funding he needed to, as he later claimed, save Blenheim Palace, while the Vanderbilts would buy their way into the British aristocracy, and Alva would regain her social standing. Nevertheless, Consuelo did not enter into the marriage willingly. When it was first brought up by her mother Alva, she had already become secretly engaged to Winthrop Rutherford, a socialite of the era who was significantly older than Consuelo. But Consuelo was completely intimidated and beholden to her mother's wishes in her youth, and despite having no interest in marrying Spencer Churchill, she agreed to the union at her mother's behest. Apparently, what tipped her into doing this was when her mother emotionally blackmailed her by claiming that her health was deteriorating dramatically, owing to Consuelo's unwillingness to agree to the marriage. The marriage was formalized on the 6th of November 1895, when Consuelo was just 18 years of age. Apparently, as she stood at the altar, she was weeping under her veil. As part of the arrangement, Marlborough received $2.5 million worth of Vanderbilt railway stock, a sum equivalent to nearly $100 million today. But while the union was enormously beneficial for the Spencer Churchills from a financial perspective, it was a disaster from a personal viewpoint. Both Consuelo and Charles had to abandon relationships they had been in as a result of the marriage, and they did not take well to one another. Indeed, Alva Vanderbilt, Consuelo's mother, freely admitted in later years that she forced her daughter to marry Marlborough. Both Consuelo and Charles quickly became involved with other people. She entered a relationship with Reginald Fellows, a cousin of Marlborough's, while the Duke took to an American socialite by the name of Gladys Marie Deacon as his mistress. By 1906, the Duke and his wife had effectively separated, though they remained officially married until the 1920s. Despite the unhappy nature of the marriage, it did result in 2 children. John Albert was born on the 18th of September 1897. He would become the 10th Duke of Marlborough in 1934. A second boy, Ivor, followed just a year after John on the 14th of October 1898. Ivor served with distinction in France during the First World War and was awarded the French Legion of Honor. Despite the inauspicious nature of her marriage to the Duke of Marlborough, Consuelo was adored by the servants and staff at Blenheim Palace and the wider Oxfordshire region in which it was situated. In the 1890s and 1900s, she was perceived as the likeable and compassionate face of the Spencer Churchill lineage, and gave generously to local maternity hospitals and charities focused on the poor. Nevertheless, Consuelo had married Marlborough at a time of increasing tensions in Europe's politics. The great powers had been locked in a bitter rivalry since the 1870s, driven by nationalist sentiment, a scramble for colonial possessions in Africa and Asia, and tensions between powers like Britain and Germany. By the early 20th century, 2 major armed alliances had developed across the continent, and in 1914, a regional crisis in the Balkans exploded into the First World War. Consuelo quickly involved herself in philanthropic and charitable work to aid the war effort in her adopted home. On the 5th of August 1914, just days after the outbreak of the war, she, along with Lou Hoover, the wife of the future US President Herbert Hoover, and Lady Randolph Churchill, established the American Women's War Relief Fund, an expatriate organization of American women designed to help fund and aid the war efforts in Britain. Over the next several years, Consuelo, through the American Women's War Relief Fund, was involved in fundraising from America to aid Britain. That is until the United States joined the war on Britain and France's side in 1917. The fund also used the money it had collected to finance knitting factories and workshops, and even equipped a military hospital. By the end of the war, what was termed the American Women's War Hospital had treated over 7,000 wounded soldiers. Consuelo and Charles eventually formalized their divorce in 1921. By then, Consuelo had long been involved in a relationship with Jacques Balsan. Balsan was a pioneer of aviation who had started working with balloons around the turn of the century, but who had then moved on to building airplanes after working with the Wright brothers, the first men to fly an airplane at Kitty Hawk in 1903. He and Consuelo had been involved with each other for many years prior to her obtaining the long-awaited divorce from Marlborough, and no sooner had this been finalised than Consuelo and Jacques married on the 4th of July 1921. He was 52 and she was 44. Consuelo's second marriage was a very happy one. In an autobiography which she had ghostwritten in the early 1950s, Consuelo referred to her time with Balsan as gold. They lived primarily in Paris in the 1920s and 1930s, and only barely escaped from the French capital in the face of the advancing Nazis in the summer of 1940, fleeing to Spain and then Portugal before heading to the United States. They settled in Florida thereafter, living out the remainder of their lives in America. Much of the later years of Consuelo and Jacques' marriage were lived in Manalapan, a small community in Palm Beach County in Florida. Here, she and her second husband constructed a large mansion which was named Casa Alva after Consuelo's mother. Built on an 150-acre estate, the house spanned 26,000 square feet, and when sold in the 1950s, was valued at $568,000, a sum equivalent to millions in today's money. Casa Alva has its own place in modern history. In 1946, Consuelo's cousin-in-law from her first marriage, the former British Prime Minister and wartime leader Winston Churchill, stayed here on his way to give a speech at Westminster College in Missouri. Thus, he is believed to have polished and practiced his famous Iron Curtain speech at Consuelo's home, one wherein he infamously described Soviet rule in Eastern and Central Europe as being like an iron curtain descending across the middle of Europe. Consuelo and Jacques spent much of their later marriage years in Florida, while also maintaining residences in New York and Long Island. In 1953, Consuelo's autobiography, which was ghostwritten by Stuart Preston, an American art critic and writer, appeared. Entitled The Glitter and the Gold, it provided an entertaining if highly selective account of her life and the world of a Gilded Age heiress. Jacques died on the 4th of November 1956 in New York City. His body was returned to France and buried in Paris. Sadly, her younger son Ivor died in September 1956 before reaching his 60th year, just weeks before Jacques. Following their passing, Consuelo sold Casa Alva and largely resided in New York and Long Island thereafter. Consuelo died at her home in Southampton on Long Island on the 6th of December 1964 at 87 years of age. Her body was returned to England and she was buried at St Martin's Church at Blaydon in Oxfordshire, not far from Blenheim Palace, next to her deceased son Ivor. Much of her fortune descended to her surviving son, the 10th Duke of Marlborough. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on these various tragic heiresses. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of their lives down below in the comments, and if you have any other suggestions or want more long compilations videos like this, be sure to let me know down below in the comments. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.